It begins with a question that has haunted humanity for centuries. Can the future be known before it happens? Not through analysis or extrapolation, but through something deeper, an intuition, a dream, a vision. And if so, what happens to the ones who glimpse it? Throughout history, scattered across decades and continents, a peculiar pattern emerges. Individuals, often ordinary, sometimes brilliant, speak of disasters before they occur. They warn, they dream, they write. Then, as if touched by the very future they foresaw, they vanish. This is not a story of predictions alone. It is a story of disappearances. From the icy waters of the North Atlantic to the scorched wreckage of Concorde, from the haunted valleys of Wales to the digital ghost towns of forgotten forums, there are people who saw catastrophe coming and were gone before the rest of us understood what they'd meant. Why do those who predict disasters so often disappear before they can be proven right? There are names, of course. Morgan Robertson, who wrote of an unsinkable ship called Titan striking an iceberg in April, 14 years before Titanic did the same. David Booth, who dreamed of a plane flipping and crashing, and 3 days later, American Airlines Flight 191 fell from the sky in precisely the way he'd described. Children who spoke calmly of their own deaths before their schools were buried in coal and silence. Engineers who warned of failing seals and misplaced generators then vanished before those warnings were echoed by fireballs and fallout. Some say it's coincidence, a trick of the mind seeking meaning. But the details are hard to dismiss. Predictions that match not only the event, but the sequence, the timing, the mechanics, not vague premonitions of doom, but precise, almost surgical foresight. What's more haunting is what follows. Silence, files missing, manuscripts gone, interviews cut short, police reports closed quickly. People erased not just from life, but from record. This story is a cinematic journey through these warnings and vanishings, 14 parts tracing a chilling pattern across the 20th and 21st centuries. Each chapter begins with a moment of eerie calm, a page written, a call made, a child whispering to her mother. Then, the unraveling. The event unfolds, history turns, and the one who tried to tell us is no longer there to explain. But this is not a tale of fear. It is a tale of the threshold between knowing and unknowing, of the fragile space where foresight meets fate. It is a meditation on what it means to see too clearly and to be seen. Perhaps these people were cursed with sight, or perhaps they were simply paying the price for knowledge no one wanted to accept. In the chapters to come, we ask not whether they were right. The facts are recorded. The disasters happened. The real question is this: why did they disappear? And what becomes of those who know what tomorrow brings, but whisper it into a world that isn't ready to listen? The story of Morgan Robertson begins not with tragedy, but with a quiet room and a restless mind. In 1898, Robertson was a struggling writer living on the edges of literary respectability. He had spent years at sea as a merchant sailor, absorbing the rhythms of engines and waves, but by the end of the century, his life had narrowed to ink, paper, and long hours of isolation. It was during one of these stretches that he wrote a short novel titled Futility, later republished as The Wreck of the Titan. At first glance, it read like a cautionary tale about human arrogance. A massive British ocean liner, the largest ever built, declared unsinkable by its designers. Too confident to carry enough lifeboats, too proud to slow down in icy waters. In April, in the North Atlantic, it strikes an iceberg on its starboard side and sinks, taking thousands with it. Robertson did not present the story as prophecy. He framed it as fiction, shaped by imagination and maritime experience. Yet the details were uncomfortably specific. The Titan's size, its speed, its triple propellers, even the month and location of the disaster. When Titanic sank in April 1912, readers dusted off Robertson's book and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the ocean. The similarities were no longer literary. They were physical, numerical, mechanical. It was as if the story had slipped forward in time and manifested itself in steel and ice. Robertson was suddenly famous, but the attention did not bring relief. Friends noticed a change in him. He grew withdrawn, uneasy, convinced that his book had marked him in some way. He told people he hadn't planned the technical details, that they had simply appeared as he wrote, as if dictated. At times, he said, it felt less like invention and more like memory. The public wanted explanations. Some accused him of insider knowledge, though none could explain how a writer could access ship designs that did not yet exist. Others dismissed it as coincidence amplified by hindsight. Robertson himself offered no clear answer. He seemed troubled by his own accuracy. Then, in 1915, only 3 years after the Titanic disaster, Morgan Robertson was found dead in a hotel room in Atlantic City. He was 53. The official cause was a heart attack. No struggle, no witnesses. But details around his death unsettled those who knew him. He had been in good health. The room had been cleaned before authorities arrived. Personal papers he'd reportedly been carrying were gone. Most curiously, the day before his death, Robertson had told his publisher he was working on a new novel, another disaster story. He claimed it would be his most accurate yet. The manuscript was never found. History remembers Robertson as a man who wrote a story too true for comfort. But what lingers is not just the prediction, it is the timing. His death came after his foresight had been proven, but before he could explain how he knew, before he could repeat it. Was Robertson simply an extraordinary observer of technology and human behavior? Or did his imagination brush against something deeper, an intuition about patterns that repeat when pride outruns caution? The sinking of the Titanic taught the world about hubris and safety. The life and death of Morgan Robertson left behind a quieter question, one that lingers in the margins of history. If you glimpse the future once, even by accident, does it look back at you? And if it does it let you speak again? It began in sleep, the same dream, night after night, growing more vivid with each recurrence. For David Booth, an ordinary office manager in Cincinnati, the line between nightmare and waking life began to blur. In May of 1979, Booth found himself haunted by a single, unchanging vision. A passenger plane lifting off, veering sharply to the left, flipping mid-air and erupting in flames as it crashed into an open field. The images came with disturbing clarity. The shape of the plane, the airline's colors, the spinning chaos before impact. He couldn't shake it. The dream returned every night for 10 days. On the 10th day, desperate and convinced this was more than imagination, Booth did something most wouldn't. He picked up the phone. He called the Federal Aviation Administration. He called American Airlines. He told them everything about the plane, the role, the field. He begged them to inspect their aircraft. He even described the specific model, a McDonnell Douglas DC-10. The response was polite, procedural, and ultimately indifferent. The FAA logged the report but took no action. American Airlines thanked him and explained they couldn't ground flights based on a dream. There was no mechanism in the system for a warning like his. 3 days later, on May 25th, American Airlines Flight 191 lifted off from Chicago O'Hare. It was a DC-10. Seconds into the climb, the plane's left engine separated from the wing, severing hydraulic lines and causing a critical loss of control. The aircraft rolled left, flipped, and plummeted into a nearby field in a fiery explosion. All 271 people aboard were killed instantly. It remains the deadliest aviation accident on U.S. soil. The crash mirrored Booth's dream down to the terrifying arc of the roll. In the days that followed, media outlets swarmed. Booth gave interviews. He was calm, but visibly shaken. He hadn't wanted to be right. It was like being forced to watch a horror movie over and over, he said, knowing you couldn't stop the ending. He spoke of guilt, not for the crash itself, but for not being able to prevent it despite trying. Then, as quickly as he'd entered the public eye, David Booth faded from it. He stopped granting interviews. Letters went unanswered. By the mid-1980s, researchers attempting to follow up couldn't locate him. Some believed he'd moved and changed his name to escape the unwanted attention. Others whispered of more dreams, of other disasters he may have foreseen, and of the unbearable burden of knowing. A lone researcher later claimed to have spoken with someone who'd known Booth. According to them, Booth had another vision of a catastrophe not yet realized, and chose to disappear before it unfolded. Whether true or apocryphal, the tale echoes a deeper anxiety. What happens when you see tragedy before it strikes and no one believes you? When you know and cannot change what's coming? David Booth was no prophet, no mystic. He was an ordinary man with an extraordinary experience, one that etched itself into aviation history not because of its accuracy, but because of what it left unanswered. He knew, he told, and then he vanished. Is foresight a gift or a burden so heavy it drives you into silence? And if knowing the future isolates you from those around you, what choice remains but to disappear into the shadows of it? It should have been a voyage of celebration. The Titanic, hailed as a triumph of human engineering, stood poised to redefine travel itself. Steel and grandeur, ambition and elegance, she was more than a ship. She was a symbol. But in the days leading up to her departure, a quiet unease crept beneath the spectacle. Some never boarded. J.P. Morgan, the financier behind the White Star Line, had reserved a personal suite. He had championed the Titanic as a showcase of progress. But days before sailing, he cancelled his trip, citing illness. Observers in France saw him in good health, relaxed, smiling. Henry Clay Frick, steel magnate, cancelled weeks earlier. To friends, he confessed a dream, a vivid, unsettling image of the ship sinking. This from a man known for pragmatism, not superstition. Others followed. Milton Hershey chose a business meeting instead. George Washington Vanderbilt changed plans at the last moment. A crewman named John Coffey, assigned to the engine room, deserted in Southampton, saying something felt wrong. He walked off the job, vanished into the crowd, and was never seen again. They left for different reasons, but a common thread ran through their decisions. Dread, whispers, dreams, gut instincts too strong to ignore. And then the Titanic sailed. 4 days later, she struck ice and slipped beneath the sea. The tragedy claimed over 1,500 lives. The unsinkable ship met its end in icy darkness, its opulence rendered meaningless in the face of nature and fate. Survivors who had cancelled bookings struggled to explain themselves. Some spoke of being followed, questioned. One woman, who had changed her travel date, wrote to a friend about strange men asking why she hadn't sailed. They seemed to believe she'd known something. 2 years later, she died in a mysterious house fire. Others faded from public view. Henry Clay Frick died within 6 months, suddenly, without prior illness. J.P. Morgan, once a titan of industry, withered and passed less than a year after the disaster. John Coffey, the man who walked away, left no paper trail. Researchers searching for him in archives found nothing past April 1912. A pattern began to take shape. Those who felt something and acted on it survived, but they did not live peacefully. It was as though the act of avoiding disaster marked them. Did they save themselves, or were they saved for a reason? And why did so many who stepped back from the brink meet quiet ends soon after? Illness, fire, disappearance, obscurity. The Titanic was more than a maritime disaster. It was a moment when intuition defied logic, when dreams overruled calendars. The people who cancelled their voyages weren't prophets. They were people listening to something unspoken, something that perhaps heard them back. In hindsight, we call it coincidence, luck, survival. But what if the price of avoiding one fate is to carry the weight of having known? What if glimpsing danger is enough to pull you out of one disaster, only to draw you into another, quieter one that no one else can see? It started with a child's voice. "I'm not afraid to die," 10-year-old Errol Mai Jones told her mother on the evening of October the 20th, 1966. "I'll be with Peter and June." She spoke calmly, as if naming friends she planned to meet. Then she described a dream. Something black, covering the school, darkness falling, silence. The next morning, the mountainside above Aberfan, a small Welsh village, gave way. A coal waste tip collapsed after days of rain, sending a wall of sludge hurtling downhill. It swallowed homes, and it buried the village school. 144 people died, 116 of them children. Errol May was among them, alongside Peter and June. Her mother reported the dream to researchers. Neighbors remembered the girls speaking of it, a premonition, in a voice too young to fully understand what it meant. But Errol May wasn't the only one. A woman in Plymouth, 200 miles away, wrote a letter on October the 20th describing a nightmare, children screaming, buried beneath something black. The letter, postmarked a day before the disaster, became a chilling artifact of foresight. In London, a man visited police on October 19th. He claimed he'd had a vision. Welsh children, crushed under a black mountain. Dismissed as unstable, he returned after the disaster to say his vision had come true. His name wasn't recorded. No one ever found him again. Then there was Fred Martin, a coal board engineer. Months before the disaster, he submitted reports warning of unstable ground. His assessments were detailed, technical, and urgent. In September and early October, his memos became more specific, describing with uncanny precision the path the slurry would take and what it would destroy. On October 19th, 2 days before Aberfan, Fred Martin died of a sudden stroke. He was 54 and healthy. His final report, dated the day before his death, was marked urgent. It would later be read aloud at the disaster inquiry. But Martin himself was gone. Investigators would later comment that his last reports didn't read like projections. They read like recollections. Not if, but when. Not possible, but inevitable. The Aberfan disaster was a tragedy of engineering negligence. But behind the facts and failures lies a quieter, more unsettling truth. Some seemed to know it was coming. A child, a mother, a stranger, an engineer. None of them were able to stop it. Some would say it's easy to look backward and find meaning, that in the wake of tragedy, our minds seek patterns and signs, but the dates don't lie. The letters, the warnings, the dreams, they came before, and those who tried to speak vanished, died, or were ignored. What does it mean to see a shadow before it falls? To glimpse the final moment of something precious and still be powerless to prevent it? Errol Mai Jones died the day after dreaming of her own end. Fred Martin died 2 days before the very collapse he described. The unnamed man disappeared after being turned away. Perhaps the real tragedy is not only in the collapse of the mountain, but in how many voices were silenced before it moved. And the question that lingers, soft as ash: if a child can see the end, why can't the world listen in time? It began on the fringes of the internet. Between November 2000 and March 2001, a user calling himself John Titor appeared on obscure online forums. He claimed to be a time traveler from the year 2036. At first, few took him seriously. His posts seemed like science fiction. Discussions of parallel timelines, technical diagrams of a time machine, predictions of future events. But buried within the eccentricity were fragments that felt uncomfortably real. Titor warned of civil unrest in America, of growing surveillance, of a public willing to trade freedom for the illusion of safety after a catastrophic attack. He posted these warnings months before September 11th, 2001. Afterward, readers returned to his words with a new kind of attention. He mentioned a rare computing problem, the year 2038 issue, little known in 2000, but now a confirmed concern among computer scientists. He predicted mad cow disease spreading in the US, which would be confirmed in 2003. He foresaw the decline of centralized media and the rise of decentralized digital information, long before social platforms took over the information landscape. Still, many dismissed him. His most dramatic predictions, a second civil war, a fractured United States, did not come to pass. But it was the precision in the smaller details that continued to haunt. Then, in March 2001, Titor disappeared. He claimed his mission was complete. He had traveled back to retrieve an IBM 5100 computer, which he said had unique capabilities critical to debugging legacy systems in his time. Oddly enough, IBM engineers later confirmed the 5100 did possess undocumented functions, matching Titor's claims, functions not publicly known in 2000. Attempts to trace his identity led nowhere. His posts originated from varied IP addresses. One lead pointed to a family in Florida, whose lawyer hinted at involvement but offered no proof. No one ever came forward. And then came the accidents. A computer scientist who claimed to have met Titor in person died in a car crash in 2003. A forum administrator who archived his posts lost everything in a suspicious house fire in 2004. Another researcher investigating the story vanished in 2006 and was found dead weeks later. Suicide, the report said. But the circumstances were unclear. It was as if those who tried to pull the thread of Titor's story too hard found themselves unraveling. Was he real? A brilliant hoaxer? A digital prophet? Maybe he was all three. But the heart of the mystery isn't just whether he came from the future. It's the ripple effect of his words, the accuracy of the obscure, the sudden silences that followed, the lives left in disorder, the data erased, the bodies found without explanation. If Titor was lying, He was the luckiest liar alive. If he was telling the truth, we've already ignored his warnings. And if knowing too much about time brings danger, whether from institutions, physics, or fate, perhaps his disappearance was less a choice and more a necessity. The forums are long gone now, digital ruins buried beneath newer noise, but the echo remains in archived threads and lost drives, whispering a question that has no answer. If someone told you the future, would you believe them? And if you did, how long would they be allowed to speak? The vision came to her in the summer of 1996. Baba Vanga, the blind Bulgarian mystic revered by many in Eastern Europe, had spent decades making predictions, some strange, some uncanny. But in her final weeks, she spoke of something darker, something coming to America. She described metal birds crashing into tall towers, fire, smoke, and grief. At the time, her attendants and visitors didn't know what to make of it. Her words, preserved in letters and diaries, felt symbolic, poetic even. 5 years later, on September 11, 2001, the image became real. Commercial airliners sliced into the World Trade Center and the towers crumbled into ash. Only then did her final vision take on its full weight. But there was more. In July 1996, Vanga told her caregiver she would die on August 11th. She named the time. She would wake, eat breakfast, see visitors, and then pass peacefully in the afternoon. She said it without fear, as if she had already lived it. On August 11th, she followed the script precisely. She died after lunch, her final words spoken quietly to a nurse at her side. The cause was listed as complications from cancer, but the timing, the precision, disturbed even those who had long accepted her gift. Before her death, Vanga left behind a series of sealed envelopes, each marked with a date. They were entrusted to the Bulgarian government and a few close confidants. Some were opened in the years that followed. In 1997, an envelope predicted a financial collapse in Asia. Months later, the Asian financial crisis erupted. Another, marked September 2001, was opened after the towers fell. The contents were never fully released. Officials admitted the description inside was disturbingly accurate. Then they classified the document. It has never been seen again. Several envelopes were never opened. The men who held them died or disappeared. Her closest aide, who held predictions marked for 2020 and beyond, died in a car crash in 1998. The envelopes were never found. Another confidant vanished in 2002. His home was cleared, his possessions gone, no forwarding address. His name faded from public memory. A journalist who'd interviewed Vanga in her final months claimed she'd shared predictions too sensitive to print. He died of sudden heart failure in 1997, age 42. His recordings and notes vanished before his family could retrieve them. Time, it seemed, was sweeping away the messengers. Baba Vanga didn't just predict events. She predicted her own death and left behind knowledge meant for future generations, knowledge that never reached them. Was it silenced, lost, or was it simply too dangerous to reveal? There is a line in prophecy, a point beyond which knowing becomes perilous. Vanga's final years seem to circle that boundary, dancing along its edge. To know the date and hour of one's death is a burden few could carry. To know what lies ahead for nations, for history, for humanity, and still choose silence is something else entirely. Perhaps it was mercy, perhaps it was fear, or perhaps the future, once glimpsed too clearly, finds a way to erase its witnesses before their truth becomes too loud to ignore. In the quiet of her final morning, as she waited for her last visitors, Vanga sat calmly. She had seen too much, and said only what the world could bear to hear. What did she leave unsaid? And who is left to open the envelopes we may never find? It was a blueprint drawn in warning, a technical prophecy rendered not in dreams, but in diagrams and reports. In the early months of 2000, an Air France engineer known publicly only as Pierre M. began submitting a series of increasingly urgent memos. He had worked on the Concorde fleet for over 15 years. He knew the aircraft intimately, its grace, its power, and its vulnerabilities. Pierre's concern focused on one chilling scenario: a tire blowout during takeoff. If debris struck the underwing fuel tanks at high speed, it could trigger a cascade of failures: fuel leak, ignition, engine flameout, crash. He referenced a near miss from 1979. He warned that the Concorde's design made it particularly susceptible. In May 2000, his final report was filed. It was precise, clinical, and harrowing. The scenario was spelled out step by step: debris on the runway, high-speed rotation, tire rupture, fuel tank pierced, fire erupting under the wing. His words read less like speculation and more like a post-mortem. Then Pierre disappeared. On July 1st, 2000, he failed to show up for work. Police found his apartment untouched, his car parked, wallet and ID still inside. There was no sign of foul play, no note, no trace. 24 days later, on July 25th, Air France Concorde Flight 4590 began its takeoff roll at Charles de Gaulle Airport. It ran over a piece of titanium debris left by another aircraft. A tire blew. Fragments pierced the wing. Fuel poured out and ignited. Flames trailed the aircraft as it lifted off. The left engine failed. Seconds later, the plane crashed into a hotel just beyond the runway, killing all 109 aboard and 4 on the ground. Every element of Pierre's report played out frame by frame. During the investigation, his memos resurfaced. Officials read them aloud. Investigators noted that his prediction matched the crash with disturbing accuracy. His disappearance was noted but not investigated further. There were no leads, no answers. Colleagues said that in the final weeks before he vanished, Pierre had grown paranoid. He spoke of being watched, of someone who didn't want his concerns publicized. But to whom could he turn? His warnings had already been ignored. His presence, perhaps, had become more inconvenient than his absence. An engineer who foresaw disaster, not through mysticism, but through analysis, disappeared just weeks before being proven right. His absence meant no interviews, no testimony, no human voice to connect the technical memo to the human cost. What if he had stayed? Could he have prevented it? Or did he vanish because someone believed he might? It raises a grim possibility that in the machinery of modern systems, truth is only welcome when it arrives too late to cause disruption. Pierre M. saw the future in friction coefficients, impact paths, and failure modes. He laid it bare, in writing, and then he was gone. Was he silenced, or did he choose to vanish, unable to bear the knowledge of what was coming? Perhaps he understood something many of us try to forget, that knowing how a disaster will unfold and watching it happen anyway is a kind of death on its own. And so his story remains, scrawled in the margins of official reports, unspoken in memorials. A warning heard too late. How many more blueprints are ignored before fate follows the lines to tragedy? And how many voices like Pierre's are lost just before the fire begins? In the waning days of 1999, the world watched the clock. The new millennium approached under a shadow called Y2K, a computer bug born from two-digit date systems. Fear of system failures rippled across industries. Planes might fall, grids might go dark, banks might lose records. Most prepared, most waited, and most believed the threat was manageable. But one voice stood apart. A software engineer, known publicly only as Thomas K., began issuing warnings, not in headlines, but in specialized interviews and tech forums. His tone wasn't hysterical, it was clinical, focused. He predicted a cascading failure, not on January 1st itself, but in the days that followed. Backup systems, he said, would falter because they used the same flawed time logic as primary systems. He described power failures in the northeastern US. He warned of transaction corruption in major financial institutions, predicting it would be discovered only days later. Quiet chaos hidden inside the code. He gave interviews under voice modulation, appeared in shadow, claimed his employer had tried to silence him, threatened legal action. He persisted. In his final interview on December 28, 1999, Thomas K. offered one last prediction. "I won't be available after January 1st, he said flatly. "They'll make sure of that. I won't get to say, 'I told you so.'" When asked who they were, he replied only, "The ones who need Y2K to pass quietly." New Year's came. Planes stayed aloft. Lights stayed on. The world exhaled. But 2 weeks later, several major banks discovered data corruption, exactly as he had described. Transaction logs from early January contained anomalies. Reconciliation processes failed. Quiet patches were deployed. Public panic was avoided. Then came the news. On January 3rd, a man was found dead in a New Jersey apartment. No ID. Fingerprints confirmed him as Thomas K. His real name was never released. Official cause, suicide by overdose. No note, no record of prior mental illness. The case was closed quickly. Former colleagues said the death made no sense. Thomas had been alert, focused, even energized in their final exchanges, not someone on the verge of despair. And then the paper trail ended. His employment records were sealed. The company he'd worked for declined comment. Journalists probing the case ran into closed doors and legal threats. The data issues he'd predicted were quietly resolved. Public attention moved on, but the timing couldn't be ignored. Thomas K. had named the window. He had outlined the failure modes, and he had warned that he wouldn't survive to be proven right. Then he died, alone, unheard. It's easy, in retrospect, to dismiss Y2K as overblown, but the code didn't fix itself. And some failures did occur, hidden beneath layers of technical silence. Was Thomas a doomsayer who couldn't bear to be wrong? Or was he right? So right that someone ensured we'd never hear the full story? In a world where most problems are fixed quietly, some truths may be too disruptive to acknowledge. And so Thomas K. became a ghost in the machine. A man who saw the flickering edge of collapse and vanished before the system could fail. The system survived, but the whistleblower didn't. And we're left to wonder, when the future comes quietly, is it better to ignore the warnings or to ask who's no longer there to repeat them? On January 28, 1986, millions watched the skies. The Challenger shuttle soared upward into the cold Florida air, carrying 7 astronauts, including teacher Krista McAuliffe. It was meant to be a symbol of progress, of education reaching for the stars. 73 seconds later, it became a fireball. The explosion stunned the nation. Grief flooded classrooms and living rooms alike. But within days, something else began to surface. Warnings, documents, voices from within NASA and its contractors, describing the very failure that had just unfolded. The most prominent of those voices belonged to Roger Boisjoli, an engineer at Morton Thiokol, the contractor responsible for the shuttle's solid rocket boosters. Months before the launch, Boisjoli had sounded the alarm. The rubber O-rings used to seal joints in the boosters could fail in cold temperatures. His memos were specific. He described the exact sequence: O-ring erosion, gas leaks, structural breach. He was ignored. After the disaster, Boisjoli testified before the Rogers Commission. He was vindicated, but his career never recovered. He became a reluctant whistleblower, burdened by the knowledge that he had tried and failed to prevent a tragedy. But he wasn't the only one. In July 1985, NASA analyst Richard Cook had written a memo stating that safety was being compromised. His concerns were buried. He was reassigned. More troubling were the warnings that never reached daylight. In December 1985, just weeks before the launch, another engineer filed a classified internal memo. It was blunt. A January launch would lead to O-ring failure and explosion. The memo's author was never named in official documents. On January 12th, 2 weeks before the launch, he died in a car crash on a clear day. No skid marks, no other vehicle, just a single car off the road. The incident was deemed an accident. In February, shortly after the disaster, another engineer who had raised concerns vanished. He had told colleagues he possessed documents proving management had ignored repeated warnings. He was scheduled to meet with investigators. He never arrived. His apartment was found empty, his files gone. The pattern became hard to ignore. Those who warned were silenced, some by bureaucracy, others by fate. Those who tried to speak louder never got the chance. The Challenger disaster wasn't just a technological failure. It was a failure of listening, of recognizing the quiet voices within complex systems who dare to say, "Stop. Wait. This isn't safe." Boisjoli later described the months before the launch as agonizing. "We were talking to brick walls," he said. He lived with the weight of what he had seen and the silence that followed. Some say that's the cost of truth in large institutions. Others believe it points to something darker, that when truth becomes too dangerous, it's not just buried, it's erased, along with those who carry it. In the final image of the shuttle rising, there's a moment of stillness, an illusion of success, then fire, then silence. And in that silence, the memory of those who knew, who tried, and who vanished before the reckoning. How many more disasters begin with ignored voices? And when systems choose momentum over caution, who pays the price for being right too early? March 11th, 2011. A magnitude 9.1 earthquake struck off the coast of Japan. Minutes later, a towering tsunami surged inland, overwhelming seawalls, crushing towns, and reaching the gates of the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant. Inside the plant, systems failed. Backup generators flooded. Cooling systems died. Reactor cores overheated and melted down. The worst nuclear disaster since Chernobyl unfolded not in hours, but in the quiet collapse of minutes. But for some, it hadn't been a surprise. In 2008, Dr. Kenji Satake, a seismologist specializing in paleotsunami research, filed a report with TEPCO, the energy company operating Fukushima. He warned that geological evidence suggested the region could face an earthquake and tsunami well beyond the plant's protective design. He recommended raising seawalls and relocating backup generators. His warnings were acknowledged and shelved. Satake continued speaking. He presented at conferences. His data showed that tsunamis over 15 meters had struck the region in the distant past, far higher than the plant's 5.7-meter seawall. He described in chilling detail what would happen if such a wave hit the plant: flooding, power loss, meltdowns. In December 2010, he vanished. Satake had traveled to the coast to study tsunami sediment layers. His rental car was found abandoned near a beach. His equipment and notes were missing. He was never found. 3 months later, the wave arrived. It matched his warnings in scale and effect. Every vulnerability he outlined became reality. He wasn't the only one. Hideki Shimizu, a former Fukushima engineer, had become an outspoken critic after leaving TEPCO in 2009. He gave interviews, warning that the seawalls were inadequate and the generators were dangerously placed. "We've built a house of cards," he said in one television appearance. In February 2011, 1 month before the disaster, he died of sudden heart failure at 48. His family reported he had received threatening phone calls in the weeks before, warnings to stay quiet. And then there was the anonymous blogger. In January 2011, a series of detailed posts appeared on a niche Japanese tech forum. The writer described the specific vulnerabilities at Fukushima. He warned of a coming earthquake, of a tsunami that would breach the walls, of generators that would flood. After the disaster, investigators searched for the blogger. The account was deleted. The author never identified. 3 voices, 1 vanished, 1 silenced, 1 erased. Each had spoken of a disaster not in metaphor, but in detail. And none survived to see the world finally believe them. The official narrative of Fukushima centers on preparedness gaps and natural forces. But behind the technical reports is another story of warnings missed or dismissed, of lives lost, not only in the tsunami's wake, but in the months before it struck. Did those voices fall to coincidence, or were they removed to preserve the illusion of safety? Perhaps the truth was too heavy to carry into daylight. And so the wave took not just concrete and steel, but memory. When the tide receded, it left behind silence. A silence that still echoes in reactor ruins and empty notebooks. In every unheeded warning, there is a choice not to listen. And in that choice, the seeds of disaster take root, waiting, patient, inevitable. They called him a fiction writer, a man of imagination. But the story Morgan Robertson penned in 1898 was not entirely his own, or so he later claimed. It was called Futility, or The Wreck of the Titan, a novella about the largest ship ever built, declared unsinkable, that strikes an iceberg in April in the North Atlantic and sinks. Most passengers perish. There aren't enough lifeboats. 14 years later, the Titanic set sail. Its length, nearly identical to the Titan. Its capacity, within dozens of the fictional number. Its fate, tragically the same. Robertson was no naval architect. He said the details came to him in a kind of trance. He didn't know where the technical specifications originated. Friends said he seemed disturbed while writing it, like he was recalling something rather than inventing it. After the Titanic disaster, he was accused of having inside knowledge. But how could he? The ship hadn't even been conceived when he wrote his story. His sudden literary fame brought questions, not comfort. He withdrew, became paranoid, told friends he was being followed, claimed another disaster was coming, and that he was writing about it. Then, in 1915, he was found dead in a hotel room in Atlantic City. Heart attack, the report said. But the room had been cleaned before police arrived. His papers were missing. The manuscript he had spoken of, his next vision, was never found. It is easy to dismiss him as a man crushed by coincidence, but the precision of his first story and the erasure of his second paint a darker picture. Years later, his name would resurface in lists of coincidences and mysteries. The man who predicted the Titanic, but his death would always be treated as an epilogue, not a chapter of its own. Then came David Booth, Errol Mai Jones, John Titor, Pierre M. Baba Vanga. Each saw something. Each warned. Each vanished, by silence, by force, by death. With Robertson, the pattern began. With him, a thread appears. Those who glimpse the shape of disaster before it happens don't stay long enough to explain how they knew. He was the first to write a tragedy before it unfolded, not as satire, not as metaphor, but as an eerie, page-for-page mirror of reality. And when he tried again, reality turned the page before he could. Perhaps the world can only tolerate so much foresight. Perhaps the future can only be told once before it reaches back and takes the teller. And perhaps Robertson's final story was never meant to be read, not by us, and not in this time. Because maybe some futures aren't just dangerous to know. Maybe they're dangerous to imagine at all. There's a moment just before catastrophe when silence deepens, a breath held, a pause before the fall. And in that moment, again and again, someone has tried to speak. They are not prophets in robes or visionaries atop mountains. They are engineers, children, office clerks, reclusive writers. Their warnings come in dreams, reports, quiet conversations, blog posts buried in forums no longer online. And yet, across more than a century of disasters, from Titanic to Fukushima, a chilling pattern repeats. A prediction is made. It is specific, verifiable, and often dismissed. Then, the predictor disappears, through death, vanishing, or deliberate silence. And the disaster arrives exactly as foretold. This pattern defies easy explanation. Some insist these are coincidences. After all, thousands of predictions are made. Some must align with reality. But randomness does not erase the unsettling precision in these cases. Others argue that these individuals had insider knowledge, that their predictions were not mystical, but secret. Facts obtained through classified channels or unauthorized access. If true, it raises its own questions. Why weren't the warnings heeded? Why did those individuals vanish? And then there's the deeper possibility, one too vast to prove or disprove, that some people, for reasons unknown, glimpse the future. If so, their stories suggest that foresight comes with consequences. David Booth dreamed of Flight 191's crash and vanished. Baba Vanga named the date of her death and warned of 9/11 years before it happened. Pierre M. outlined Concorde's destruction and disappeared weeks before it came true. John Titor spoke of digital collapse and surveillance and then was never heard from again. What links them is not just accuracy, it's timing. They vanish after speaking, but before being proven right. Perhaps there is something intolerable about foreknowledge. Perhaps the world has mechanisms, human or otherwise, that cannot allow certain truths to live too long in the open. Or maybe it is the knowledge itself that becomes too much. The isolation, the burden of watching a disaster form and knowing no one will listen until it's too late. What's most haunting is the space they leave behind. The child's desk left empty after Aberfan. The erased hard drive from a burned house. The final manuscript vanished from a hotel room desk. In those absences, we see the shape of something we don't fully understand. a cost, a silence, a pattern. And it begs the question, what would you do if you knew something terrible was coming and no one believed you? Would you warn them and risk being erased? Or would you stay silent and carry the weight of knowing? In the end, maybe it's not the disaster that defines these stories. It's the person who saw it first, and the whisper they left behind. The final thread weaves through them all. A struggling author writes a fictional shipwreck, eerily matching a tragedy yet to come. A child dreams of blackness covering her school and says goodbye the night before it happens. Engineers, scientists, ordinary people each offer warnings and then vanish into silence. What connects them is not prophecy, but timing. Not mysticism, but consequence. They disappear in the space between knowing and being proven right. Some may call it fate, others conspiracy, or perhaps something more elemental, that the universe resists premature revelation, that causality has limits, that to know the future too clearly is to break something sacred. The stories we've explored are not about fear, they are about the human ache to be heard, the need to speak a truth others can't yet bear, and the terrible solitude of those who do. Perhaps that is why the future hides itself, not because it is unknowable, but because it is unbearable when faced alone. And so we return to the beginning. Why do those who predict disasters disappear before they happen? Because truth, uninvited, is often unwelcome. Because seeing clearly is not the same as being believed. Because warning the world does not mean it will listen. And yet, we listen now. Not to predict, but to remember. To honor the quiet voices who tried to tell us what was coming. Not to cause panic, but to stir awareness. Not to control the future, but to remind us it is fragile. That every disaster begins not with the event, but with a choice, to listen or to look away. In that choice lies everything. So when the next whisper comes, in a dream, a report, a voice too small to fill a room, will we hear it? Or will we ask, again, too late, why didn't we listen? And where did the one who tried to warn us go? The past cannot be changed, but the future perhaps is still waiting for someone brave enough to see it, and a world finally ready to listen before silence falls again.